Hi, good evening. My name is Teresa. So does translation matter, as Zoe introduced? That's the question I was trying to answer from my comparative reading of the Diamond Sutra in Sanskrit, English, and Chinese. I press the down.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Can anyone imagine anything more valuable than countless universes filled with precious jewels and gems? Let's hear what the Buddha tells us. So the Buddha said that instead of filling the billion worlds with the seven treasures and giving them as gifts to the Tathagatas, the Arhat, the fully enlightened ones, this good son or daughter comprehended only one verse with 4 lines of this teaching, illuminated and explained it in detail to others. This alone would bring forth a greater store of merit that is considered immeasurable. So the Buddha tells us that only one verse of this teaching is proven to be more valuable. Then what is this teaching? This teaching, as the Buddha said, is called the Prajna Paramita. So Prajna Paramita Sutras emerged during the early phase of Mahayana Buddhism from 100 BCE to 600 CE. There are 38 texts in this genre. The Diamond Sutra is the oldest, composed in Sanskrit in 100 BCE. The Diamond Sutra holds a unique position in the Buddhist tradition. It is considered to be one of the holiest texts, most widely chanted and recited among the Buddhist community. The text records the Buddha's teaching in Jetavana, a place in northern India near Nepal, where the Buddha spent 25 years. It collects a response to the question of one of the greatest disciples named Subhuti, and Subhuti's question relates to the ideal standard of a bodhisattva's behavior. A bodhisattva is an enlightened being who resolves to generate a heartfelt aspiration to attain Buddhahood so that one can help others gain freedom from suffering. And bodhisattva's ideal is to vow to lead all beings to a realm of nirvana without being attached to the misconception of a self, a being, a soul, or a person. And the bodhisattva's charitable deeds can only be meritorious if the misconception of a self does not taint it. The Diamond Sutra also sets forth the doctrine of emptiness or shunyata, even though this technical Sanskrit term has not yet appeared in this particular text. But the text repeatedly stressed that all phenomena are falsely imagined to have a self, a soul, or a being, when in fact they lack. When arguing for the emptiness of phenomena, the Buddha makes use of the paradoxical logic of not statements, which use the formula A is not A, therefore it is A. So this formula was used in 14 sections out of 32 throughout the text. For example, in section 10, the text reads, self-existence is no existence, as taught by the Tathagata. Therefore, it is said by him to be self-existent. So these statements put the reader in between affirmation and negation, which, as scholars argue, will no longer appear odd if one can free oneself from the either-or ecological standpoint. So the Diamond Sutra was divided into 32 sections with brief headings by Chinese prince in the 5th century CE. Later scholars have divided it further into part 1, including sections 1 to 12, and part 2, including the later sections. The separation was based on the argument that section 13 first names the text, seemingly concluding it, and also the later sections in part 2 contain many repetitions of paragraphs that were already contained in earlier sections. Scholars such as Edward Kant believes that the later sections were a mere collection of stray fragments that have been tacked onto the original text. This hypothesis was somewhat supported by Seng Zhao, the foremost disciple and assistant to Kumarajiva, the Chinese translator. Seng Zhao commented after section 12, that the first part ends here. In terms of the version studied for the paper, the Sanskrit version was sourced from the University of the West, a private institute located here in LA. The version was provided to them by the Nagarjuna Institute of Exact Methods in Nepal, and my translation from the Sanskrit version to English was presented in my paper. The Chinese version I selected was the oldest and most popular version by Kumarajiva, done in 5th century CE. It is one of the 6 surviving Chinese translations, all of which are in classical Chinese. This is the formal literary language used in China from the 5th century BCE to early 20th century. This version also serves as the primary source for other East Asian versions, including the Japanese and Korean version. Although there's no modern Chinese translation of the text, many commentators have written comments in modern Chinese on this translation. So some of them have been drawn off this paper. On the other hand, the English version was significantly more recent. In particular, two versions were used for this paper. The first was by Edward Conze, published in 1958. It's the oldest English version and rendered from Sanskrit. The other was the Rapine version in 2001, which he has translated into English drawing from both the Sanskrit and Chinese version. So in the next few slides, I'm going to summarize my key findings from my comparative reading. The first key finding lies in the tension of preserving the original text versus streamlining it. So what I found was the English translations tend to adhere closely to the original, doing line by line and word for word translation. The Chinese translation tends to be more concise, where the translator will streamline or rephrase some of the text. An example can be seen in the Buddha's official title, in Sanskrit, Tathagata Arhat Samyak Sambuddha. In English, the Tathagata, the Arhat, the fully enlightened one. The Chinese simplifies it into only two characters, Ru Lai, meaning thus come. There is going to be an interesting discussion about this name later. Another example can be seen in section 18 on the discussion of the emptiness of Chitta Dhara, or the stream of thoughts. So the word Dhara, or stream here, is significant because it describes the constant flowing nature of the mind. But it was odd to find that Kumalajiva, in his Chinese translation, he omits Dhara entirely. So even though the streamlining may enable the text to be more concise and more convenient for recitation, some central messages may be lost. The next key finding relates to the divergence between trying to translate the text versus interpreting the text. So what I found was the more modern English versions were more neutral, whereas the more ancient Chinese versions like to add stylistic or doctrinal modifications. So an example can be seen in section 9 on the emptiness of the 4 stages of sanctity. This is and one of the important teachings in earlier mainstream Buddhism, and namely stream enterer, once returner, non-returner, and the worthy one. So we see on the left, the English version uses consistently translation for the names of these stages, whereas on the right, we see Kumalajiva's Chinese version adopts a hybrid model where he blends translation with transliteration. So with this blending, the reader can grasp both phonetic and semantic cues. Another example of such modification can be seen in section 22, where it repeats a passage from section 7. So the Sanskrit and English versions repeat these passages word for word, whereas the Chinese version reworks the passage, reversing the role of the Buddha and Subhuti, and reworks Subhuti's tone. So these modifications reduces repetition and highlights core teaching. Another modification can be seen in section 32, or the last section of the text, where Subhuti asks how one should disseminate this text. So the Sanskrit and English versions repeat another logic of not statement, whereas in Chinese version, Kumalajiva adds his own phrase, 不取于相，如如不动, which Conze has translates into when he does not seize upon signs, suchness remains unmoved. Later commentators even argue that these 8 Chinese characters in fact encapsulate the essence of the entire text and the concept of wisdom, providing a profound conclusion to the entire text. Another example can be seen in the discussion of Lakshana Sampad. Lakshana was mentioned by Rory earlier. So this refers to the 32 extraordinary marks of the Buddha, each of which arises from 100 meritorious deeds, and also signifies the final stage of attaining Buddhahood. So throughout the discussion on this topic, the Sanskrit and English versions maintain terminological consistency, but Kumarajiva changes his translation every time this concept appears, using 诸相, 32相, 身相, 相, etc. So these variances in translation may reduce repetitiveness, but may also confuse reader when comparing across sections. The next key finding lies in the uniqueness of Sanskrit. Every language possesses unique structural and phonetic qualities, and its subtleties are inevitably diluted by translation. So for the Sanskrit students in the room, we've all learned about the Sandhi rule, meaning joining. So when two words are put together, their spelling or pronunciation may change according to the adjacent letters. So as a result of that, the epithet of Buddha, Tathagata, can be interpreted in two ways. First as Tathagata, meaning thus gone, or second as Tathagata, meaning thus come. So, so section 17 of the text includes a paragraph that describes how this name can actually convey the Buddha's transcendent nature of being neither coming nor going. There's no beginning or ending, only suchness. As we've seen earlier, the Chinese translation of his name is Rulai, meaning thus come. And the Chinese picked this name because they want to emphasize the Buddha's compassionate manifestation, but in fact deviating from the text's core message. The English translations like to keep the names in transliteration, but at the same time losing the etymological richness in the original Sanskrit language. The next key finding has to do with the standardization of Buddhist technical terms. So being the first and most prominent Chinese translation, Kumarajiva's version became the standard for later Chinese Buddhist translators and translators in other parts of East Asia. So this enabled cross-textual and cross-regional communication, but he's employed Chinese characters that are rarely used outside of Buddhist context. For example, the Chinese equivalent for prajna paramita is 般若波罗蜜多. So for somebody that are unfamiliar with Buddhist concepts or Sanskrit, some of these words may sound similar to pineapple, meaning 菠萝, sounding 菠萝, or mi, honey. So on the other hand, the English versions lack standardization. Again, for prajna paramita, Hans has rendered it into wisdom which has gone beyond, whereas Rapine has translated it into perfection of wisdom. So this lack of standardization may complicate cross-textual comparisons, but it may avoid misunderstanding because they're more intuitive for readers unfamiliar with Sanskrit. The next key finding lies in the cultural adaptation of different versions. So when Buddhism was introduced into China in the 1st century CE, it met resistance from what was already a vigorous intellectual and cultural tradition based on Confucian classics and Taoist religion. So Kumarajiva's translation was influenced by orthodox indigenous cultures. For example, in section 7, the word asangsplita or unconditioned was translated into wu wei, which is a fundamental Taoist concept, often understood as non-action. Another example from section 12, the word chaitya or sanctuary was translated into 佛塔庙. This word miao means temple, and it relates to the Chinese tradition of ancestor worship, which dates back to 2000 BCE and is believed to influence the descendants' fortune. So by choosing these phrases, he was able to relate to his Chinese audience more easily and help the spread of Buddhism in China. Another aspect of cultural adaptation lies in the shared epistemological frameworks between Indian and Chinese thought. Both historically located consciousness in the cardiac region, so the heart. So this important word chitta has puzzled many Western translators and has been translated into a wide range of English words. For example, mind, consciousness, mind stuff, thinking principle, mental capacity. But because of the shared framework, the Chinese was able to translate it consistently into only one word, xin in Chinese. Another aspect of such cultural adaptation was due to the influence from orthodox Indian philosophical schools, The Dharma Sutra emerged within a rich philosophical milieu, engaging with contemporaneous and historical Indian schools of thought. So as we've seen earlier from the discussion of the self, we know that the Buddhist conception of the self being empty directly opposed the orthodox Indian Vedic view. And such fundamental philosophical divergence is not mirrored in either Western or Chinese cultures. So they are inevitably diluted in the translation. For example, in section 10, there was a discussion about the difference between Kaya and Atman, Kaya being the physical body and Atman being the essential self. So the Western translators attempt to preserve such distinction by translating them into different words, but it was odd to find that Kumarajiva in fact uses the same word for these two concepts, which again obscures the central message. So the last key finding lies in the onomastic significance in the Buddhist text. These are the names of people and places that are carefully chosen to carry doctrinal meanings. And I found a divergence between phonetic preservation in English versions and meaning transmission in the Chinese translations. An example can be seen in section 1. The name of the garden where the teaching took place is called Anada Pindada, meaning almsgiver to the defenseless. And the name memorializes the disciple with the same name because he secured a sanctuary for the Buddha. And the Chinese named him Gei Gudu, meaning giving to the solitary. Another example can be seen in section 10, where the name of a previous Buddha, Dipankara, appeared. Dipankara means light maker, and he was named such because he prophesied the Buddha that we know, Shakyamuni's future spiritual biography, before he even became the Buddha. So the Chinese calls him Randeng Fo, meaning lamp lighting Buddha. But in both of these cases, the English translations would keep them as transliteration, as we see, sometimes missing the diacritics. But this obscure the doctrinal significance of the names for the readers unfamiliar with Sanskrit. So to sum up, from my comparative study of the Dharma Sutra in Sanskrit, English, and Chinese, I see a dynamic interplay between text and context. Even though the core teachings remain largely intact, different translations present interesting variances. Using the famous Buddhist metaphor of a raft, I feel that every rendering of the text is another raft, which is merely a tool and method to help us cross to the other side, pointing towards a greater truth. Any version of the text should not be mistaken as the truth itself, refracting its light through the prism of language and culture. Thank you. Oh, one last word. I want to wish my son happy birthday.